She was sleeping under the Meridian Street overpass when the car stopped, not slowing, stopped. A black Escalade, engine running, hazards on, at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, when the temperature had dropped to 23 degrees and the wind off the river was cutting through everything. The back door opened and a man in a cashmere coat stepped out and crouched down in front of the woman in the sleeping bag and said, "Please, I need your help." His name, though she didn't know it yet, was Gerald Ashworth. His net worth was $1.4 billion. His wife was dying in the ICU at Hargrove Medical Center 4 miles north, and the specialist who had flown in from Johns Hopkins had told him 4 hours ago that there was nothing left to try. Gerald Ashworth had not accepted that answer. He had asked his assistant to make calls. The calls had led through a chain of connections that would later seem improbable and in the moment seemed like the only thread left, to a name. The name had led to an address that was not an address. And so Gerald Ashworth was crouching on cold concrete in a cashmere coat in front of a woman named Dr. Cecilia Marsh, who had been sleeping under the Meridian Street overpass for 7 months, and who was the only person in the city who might know how to save his wife. Start 11 years before the overpass. This is the whole story. Dr. Cecilia Marsh had been the kind of doctor that other doctors described with a particular word: singular. Not exceptional, not gifted. Singular meaning she occupied a category alone, meaning her thinking ran along channels that standard medical education didn't produce and couldn't replicate, meaning that when she walked into a diagnostic meeting, the other physicians in the room became slightly more alert in the way that musicians become more alert when someone extraordinary sits down at the piano. She had graduated first in her class from Howard Medical School, completed her residency at Mass General, and spent the following 8 years as a diagnostician and research physician specializing in rare autoimmune and neurological conditions, the category of illness that other specialists had already given up on. The patients who came to her after the third and fourth and fifth opinion had all said the same thing. Her solve rate on cases referred to her as unsolvable was 63%, in a field where 30% would have been remarkable. 63 was the kind of number that generated journal articles and speaking invitations and the quiet reverence of colleagues who had been practicing twice as long. She had also, for those same 8 years, been managing something that she managed the way she managed everything, methodically, privately, with the same precision she brought to diagnostic work. Her husband's death, sudden, cardiac, 41 years old, the kind that leaves no time for preparation, had cracked something open in her that she had been trying to hold closed ever since, with work and structure and the sheer forward momentum of being indispensable. It had worked, until it didn't. The depression that came for her at year 9 was not the kind that announces itself. It was the kind that moves in quietly and rearranges the furniture and makes you believe the rearranged version is how things always were. She had missed a diagnosis, not a case she would normally have caught, a combination of factors she would later reconstruct with painful accuracy. But a miss nonetheless, and the patient had died. And Cecilia had sat with that death in the specific way that physicians who have never missed sit with their first miss, as if the ground had opened. She had taken leave, the leave became longer. The prescription that helped became a dependency she didn't recognize as a dependency until it had reorganized her life around itself. The apartment went, the position went, the contacts she didn't reach out to, and who didn't reach out to her, which was its own quiet devastation. The isolation of a person whose professional network had been their entire social world, suddenly disconnected from both. By month 7, she was under the Meridian Street overpass with a sleeping bag and a medical textbook she carried out of habit, even when she was no longer sure why. She still read. She still thought. The mind that had solved the unsolvable did not stop working because the circumstances of its owner had collapsed. In the homeless encampment under the Meridian overpass, she had become the person people came to when they were sick, not because she'd told anyone she was a doctor, but because it had become apparent, through small accumulating evidence, that she knew things. She had identified a diabetic emergency in a man named Robert 2 days before it would have killed him and convinced 2 people to help get him to the emergency room. She had recognized cellulitis in a woman named Donna and told her, with enough specificity to be credible, exactly what to say to the triage nurse to be taken seriously. She carried aspirin and a blood pressure cuff she had found at a thrift store and a small notebook in which she had been for 7 months, recording symptoms and observations and the differential diagnoses she ran in her head the way she had always run them, because she could not stop, because thinking was the one thing the depression had not taken, because the mind is the last thing to go, and sometimes the first thing that saves you. The encampment under the Meridian overpass had perhaps 20 regular residents and a rotating population of another dozen who came and went. It had its own social architecture, the way these places always do, its own hierarchies of trust, its own codes of conduct, the small, careful economies of shared space and limited resource. Cecilia had entered it 7 months ago as a stranger and had been received with the particular wariness that new arrivals received, and had spent the first 2 months earning a different kind of reception by being useful without being intrusive. She had not announced herself, she had simply noticed and acted on what she noticed, and gradually the encampment had arrived at its own understanding of what she was. Robert knew. He was the one who had been closest to the diabetic crisis, the one she had sat with through the night, monitoring his breathing and his temperature with nothing but her hands on the blood pressure cuff and 20 years of clinical pattern recognition. He had asked her the next day, straightforwardly, who she was. She had told him the abbreviated version. Doctor, she had been a doctor. Things had gone wrong. She was working on it. He had nodded with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had heard many versions of things went wrong, and understood that the category was wide and the details were private. She had not told anyone else, not her full name, not her credential, not the person she had been. That person felt like someone she had lost the right to claim. She went by Cece. She slept under the overpass and read and thought and kept the notebook and waited for something she could not have articulated, in the way that people wait when they have not yet understood that waiting is what they are doing. She was 47 years old, and the temperature was 23 degrees when Gerald Ashworth crouched on the concrete in his cashmere coat and said, "Please, I need your help." She did not say yes immediately. That was the first thing Gerald Ashworth would later tell people, that she hadn't been waiting to be asked, hadn't been grateful for the chance, hadn't done any of the things that the story might have suggested she would do. She had looked at him with the flat, diagnostic attention of someone assessing a situation for what it actually was. She had asked 3 questions. What is the diagnosis? What have the treating physicians tried? Who is the specialist from Johns Hopkins, and what exactly did he say? Gerald Ashworth answered all 3 with the precision of a man who had been absorbing medical information for 72 hours out of desperate necessity. His wife, Elaine, had been admitted 6 days ago with what initially presented as a severe respiratory infection. It had progressed. The Johns Hopkins specialist, a pulmonologist named Dr. Gareth Hines, who was among the top 5 in his field nationally, had ruled out bacterial causes, viral causes, fungal causes, standard autoimmune presentations. Her lung tissue was deteriorating at a rate that could not be explained by anything they'd identified. She was on maximum ventilator support. She had, Dr. Hines had said, perhaps 48 hours, possibly less. Cecilia was quiet for a long moment. The wind off the river moved through the overpass. "What's her travel history for the past 6 months?" she said. Gerald stared at her. "What? Travel. Where has she been?" He thought. Southeast Asia in March, a philanthropic trip to Vietnam and Cambodia, a safari in Kenya in July, a wine trip through Portugal in September. Cecilia was already sitting straighter. Something had shifted in her posture, the quality of attention that her former colleagues would have recognized immediately, the specific alertness that meant a differential had opened up that warranted following. "Kenya?" she said. "Which region?" The Masai Mara, and somewhere north, a conservation project, near freshwater sources, a lake, a river, standing water. Gerald's eyes changed. There was a lake. She swam in it. She said it was extraordinary, that the color. Cecilia stood up. She reached into the sleeping bag and pulled out the notebook. The battered composition book with 7 months of observations and differential diagnoses, and the accumulated residue of a mind that had never stopped working, and she opened it to a blank page and wrote 4 words. She handed it to Gerald. He read it. He looked at her. "That's what you think this is," she said. "It's rare enough that Hines may never have seen a case. It presents as respiratory because that's where the damage concentrates, but it's parasitic, not infectious. The treatment protocol is completely different. If I'm right, she's been receiving treatment that's actively working against her. She paused. If I'm wrong, she has 48 hours and nothing changes. He was 56 years old and had spent 30 years making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he was standing under a bridge at 2 in the morning looking at a woman in a sleeping bag who had just told him in 45 seconds what a Johns Hopkins specialist had not arrived at in 6 days. He said, "Will you come?" She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not hesitation. Something older and more complicated. The question of whether she still had the right to walk back into a place she had walked out of. Whether the person she had been was still there to be called on. Whether showing up at a hospital as the person she currently was, under the overpass, the notebook, the sleeping bag on concrete, would be received as anything other than an obstacle. She thought about Robert and the diabetic crisis. She thought about Donna and the cellulitis. She thought about 20 years of patients who had come to her as the last resort and the 63% she had managed to pull back from that edge. She thought about the 48 hours the Johns Hopkins specialist had given Elaine Ashworth. Yes, she said. She said it the way she had always made decisions. Quickly, once the data was in. In the Escalade, Gerald's assistant handed her a phone with Elaine's full medical chart loaded, imaging, labs, treatment log, the specialist's notes. Cecilia read it in the 20 minutes between the overpass and the hospital the way she had always read charts, completely, linearly, building the picture from the data without jumping to conclusions before the data was exhausted. She annotated nothing. She asked Gerald 2 more questions. She looked out the window once, briefly at the city moving past in the dark, and then looked back at the chart. The hospital's entrance was lit and quiet the way hospitals are quiet at 3 in the morning. A stillness that is not peace, but suspended urgency, the particular atmosphere of a building that never fully sleeps because it cannot afford to. Cecilia walked through the automatic doors in her 7-month-old clothes with the composition notebook under her arm and the hospital chart on a borrowed phone and the complete, assembled certainty of a differential that was either going to be right or wasn't going to matter. The night security guard looked at her. Gerald said her name and her credential, and the guard who had been briefed stepped aside. Dr. Gareth Hines met them in the ICU family consultation room at 3:06 a.m. Gerald had called ahead. The hospital administrator on night duty had, after a tense and improbable series of calls, confirmed that Dr. Cecilia Marsh's medical license was current, lapsed in 1 state, active in 2 others because licenses in the states where she had done her fellowship work had been maintained through automatic renewal that she hadn't been organized enough to cancel, and that now, impossibly, constituted the thin procedural thread that allowed her through the door. Dr. Hines was a tall man with the economy of movement that very busy physicians develop. No wasted gesture, no unnecessary expression, attention rationed like a resource. He looked at Cecilia when she walked in, and he did not quite manage to arrange his face into neutrality, because there was no protocol in 30 years of medicine that had prepared him for a woman in 7-month-old clothes with a composition book under her arm being introduced by a billionaire at 3 in the morning as the person who might save his patient. He looked at Gerald. Gerald said, "Please listen to her." Hines sat down. She walked into the consultation room and said, "I think it's Katayama syndrome with atypical pulmonary presentation." She swam in fresh water in East Africa in July. The acute phase would have resolved before she sought treatment, and the current presentation mirrors what we'd expect at week 12 to 16 of schistosomal migration. Gareth Hines, who had 300 publications and 2 named clinical protocols and had been the last resort for patients from 14 countries, looked at the woman across the table. He looked at her clothes. He looked at Gerald Ashworth, whose expression communicated everything that the situation could not explain on its own. He looked back at Cecilia. He said, "Walk me through the mechanism." She did. Differential, mechanism, the specific way that schistosomal larvae in atypical migration would produce the precise pattern of lung tissue damage in Elaine Ashworth's imaging. The treatment protocol, the antiparasitic regimen, the corticosteroid management to address the inflammatory response, the monitoring parameters for the first 24 hours. She spoke from memory, from the part of her brain that had been running differentials for 7 months, under a bridge and 20 years before that in hospitals. And she spoke with the specificity and confidence of someone who was not performing expertise, but inhabiting it. When she finished, Dr. Hines was quiet for 15 seconds. Then he said, "I need to make a call." The call was to a parasitologist at the CDC who confirmed within 40 minutes that the presentation was consistent with the hypothesis. The treatment was initiated at 4:44 a.m. By noon, Elaine Ashworth's oxygen levels had stabilized for the first time in 6 days. By the following morning, they were improving. 5 days later, she was breathing without ventilator assistance. The pulmonologist charting her recovery used the word remarkable 3 times in 2 days, and then stopped using it because it had become insufficient. Dr. Gareth Hines submitted a case report to the New England Journal of Medicine that December. The report listed, in its acknowledgments, the name of the physician whose initial hypothesis had redirected the diagnostic approach. The acknowledgment read, "The authors wish to thank Dr. Cecilia Marsh, whose clinical insight at a critical juncture was decisive." It was 3 lines. It was printed in the most widely read medical journal in the world. Cecilia Marsh did not return to the overpass after the night of the hospital. That was not because her circumstances had instantly changed. They hadn't. Not in the first days. It was because Gerald Ashworth had, in the hours between the consultation room and his wife's first stable readings, done what people who have been given back something irreplaceable sometimes do. He had asked what he could do. Not his performance, not his transaction. He had sat across from Cecilia in the hospital cafeteria at 6 in the morning with 2 coffees and asked the question as if the answer mattered to him in the specific way that Elaine's life mattered to him, which was the only way that counted. She had told him about the dependency, about the leave, about the mist that had started everything, about the 7 months. She told it the way she told differentials, factually, sequentially, without self-pity, and without omission. She was not asking for anything. She was answering the question she'd been asked. He had listened the way she had listened to him under the bridge at 2 in the morning. What followed was not a rescue. Cecilia would be clear about this distinction for the rest of her life. In interviews and in the memoir she would eventually write and in the keynote addresses she would give to medical students who needed to hear it, Gerald Ashworth had not rescued her. He had provided access to the residential treatment program that addressed the dependency, to the malpractice review board that re-examined the case she had been carrying and determined that the miss, while tragic, had been within the standard of care for the information available, to the professional network that had dispersed but had not entirely dissolved. He had opened doors. She had walked through them herself. These were different things. She was insistent about this. The treatment took 8 months. The license was fully reinstated in all 3 states 11 months after the night under the bridge. The position, not the old position, a new one built around the diagnostic work she did best and structured to protect what the old position had not protected, began 14 months after the overpass. She was 48 when she went back. She was a different kind of doctor than she had been before. Not better or worse, her colleagues would say, but differently aware. More attentive to the patients who arrived at the end of the line of other opinions. More careful about the ones who came to her, already carrying what she recognized as the weight of having been told there was nothing left. She knew what nothing left felt like from the outside. She knew what it felt like to be the something that was actually still there. Elaine Ashworth sent a letter 3 months after she came home from the hospital. 4 pages, handwritten, on cream stationery. Cecilia read it once in her car and then once more in her office, and then put it in the desk drawer she reserved for things she wanted to be able to find again. The last line of the letter said, "I have been told that you were sleeping under a bridge. When my husband found you, I want you to know that when I think about what that means, that you were there, that you were still thinking, that you still had all of that in you. I think it may be the most extraordinary thing I have ever heard. Please don't stop." Cecilia opened a new patient file the morning after she read that letter. She didn't stop. The notebook, the battered composition book, with 7 months of observations and differential diagnoses, the record of a mind that had kept working when everything around it had stopped, sat on the corner of her desk where she could see it, not as a reminder of what she had survived, as a record of what had never left, the thinking, the precision, the absolute refusal of the diagnostic mind to go quiet just because the world had gone dark around it. The mind is the last thing to go. Sometimes it's the first thing that saves you. And sometimes, at 2:17 a.m. on a cold Tuesday in November, it saves someone else first, and in doing so, quietly and completely saves itself.